you impressed me so much with your discussion of the depth of your musical knowledge when we talked. You know, we've all watched you for years as the young upstart bass player, incredible character, tearing it up on stage, and now as you've gotten to this point in your life, you have a depth of musical understanding that's really quite special. You know, I think this is why it's all worth not sending us all to the Soylent Green tanks, by the way, because we actually do know a few things now. But, you know, your discussion of that was fantastic. What are you doing these days? You're playing with mostly hot tuning, or your major project?
That's my primary musical outlet. We both do electric, which means you add drums. Go figure that out. It's the only real acoustic instrument on stage. But anyway, you add drums in your electric, and then you add some more wattage. But, you know, I've always had an affinity for chamber music, for small combinations of music where you hear the character of the players and the interaction of what you can produce with just a few people. So Ewan McAlkin and myself, we started playing together in 1958 when I was 14, he was 17. 58. And that was like Buddy Holly covers and all that kind of stuff in a small band. I was playing a guitar then. And actually a lot of the bands, you would have another guitar player that would just play on the low strings of the guitar, and that was the bass, you know. In any case, I started playing bass as well in 1960 when I got my first jazz bass, Fender jazz bass. But I've always enjoyed classical music, and being raised in Washington, D.C., I had the wonderful opportunity to be right in the center of the Appalachian Mountains, the music from the Appalachian Mountains, the country music in general, rhythm and blues, jazz, classical music, the folk music revival of the early 60s, and all of that going on, and just from my becoming aware years from when I started playing guitar at 12 years old in 1956. So when I was really young, this is somewhat of a shaggy story here, but I had rheumatic fever when I was 7. I was put in this children's hospital in Maryland for a year. My father is a doctor, and my uncle's a doctor. Wow. My father's a dentist, and they got me in a trial program for penicillin, as it turned out, because it was just being used, applied in the civilian world after the Second World War for infection. So they tried this on rheumatic fever, and that part of the story, it worked. You know, half of us got the penicillin, half of us didn't, with the obvious results. And but I had I wasn't allowed to move. In those days, they didn't let you move. I was in bed for 6 months, you know. So you had to figure out things to do with your mind, and you know, I couldn't go out and play and all that kind of stuff. And music was one of the things that I was able to appreciate, and it also would take me out of the realm of the hospital and all these little kids dying, and it put me into a world that was created with my mind and my senses and my imagination. And this small combination of players, whether later on when I was around 11 years old, started listening to Bix Beiderbecke and all these musicians of the 20s and 30s. Luckily, my father belonged to the American Jazz Society, and he was an audiophile, and we listened to records all the time. And he at that time, I liked a lot of the big band stuff that was in the early 50s. That was a little too sweet and organized for me. I liked the stuff coming out of the late 20s that had a lot more interaction with the musicians, but also I could hear the personality, and I could really get excited. And I started listening to Jelly Roll Morton and wondering about Storyville and New Orleans and all these stories, the Library of Congress recordings. And when I was about 12, I started going down to the Library of Congress, and you check yourself in and check records out, you know, disc out, and you go in little booths and play these, you know. It got so bizarre, I was listening to, you know, Alan Smith recordings of the Rainforest, and, I mean, Alan Lomax recordings of the Rainforest and Harry Smith collection and all these kinds of things. today, we have the internet, which is fabulous for exploring music from all over the world, and people are starting to respond to that and use influences of all kinds of music. But in any case, when I got a chance to get on the number 12 bus and go downtown to hear various concerts, various classical music concerts at Lisner Auditorium, or so many of the great places you could hear in Washington, D.C. I got to hear these great pieces up close in person and there wasn't as much sound reinforcement then at all. So you really heard, the singers had to project and the musicians had to project with their instruments. It wasn't pushed up, with a great, Meyer sound system like it is today. So I was just submerged in this world of tone, and it's followed me around my whole life.
World of tone.
That's the seductive nature of any instrument, is the tone. The tone is what draws you in from around the corner. The tone is the thing before you can even discern the melody. It's that seductive nature. And when a musician has great tone, has developed their own individual tone, and everyone has their own tone. Their DNA makeup's different, all three of us sitting here. The molecules in my fingers are different than Bobby's and different than Tom's here. And when I teach out at the Yarmouth-Calkin and Fur Peace Ranch in southeast Ohio, I stress that to my students, that everyone has something unique to develop, but you have to learn to start listening for it. But it's followed me around my whole life, tone. And when I had the pleasure of being in front of Yusef Lateef and Charles Mingus and Eric Dolphy, one of the great inspirations of my life, you see him play the bass clarinet in front of you, and he'd be like this far away from me, and you'd hear these resonances coming out of the instrument that would just move you to tears. And regardless of the melody or his approach or what he was doing with the notes and the linear structure of the music, when I heard Charlie Mingus or Ray Brown in front of me, or Scotty LaFerrari, or all these people, and I'm 15 years old or something, I'm hearing that their fingers touch the strings. I get a chair up there in a little club, and I sit in front and listen. And interestingly enough, I didn't have the training. It's a violin, I didn't have that training, but I was a guitar player. But when I moved to bass when I was 16, I started playing bass as well. I found myself going up the neck of the bass into the cello range, because some of the great cellists that I'd heard, those resonances would just tear me up.
Right to the heart.
So I've tried to incorporate all of that in my playing, from using the lowest lows and the simplest of notes and laying down patterns to really perhaps far too many notes than the piece ought to have. And but with that in mind, as you move through different stages of your career, you try to shore up maybe defects in your playing physically, or rediscover things you've forgotten already. At the same time, the tone is always what pulls me back, And I tell my students, I say, sit down and just hit an open A note on the 3rd string of your 4-string bass, and move your fingers over the string until you like the sound. Find that sound first, then center yourself, and then start playing. Don't play in front of the TV with your electric bass not plugged in if you're playing electric bass, It doesn't do any good. You just, you're not listening to what you're actually playing, and so that's kind of where my approach is to the instrument, And that's why I've got a number of acoustic basses at home. A Gil B30, I've got a Dave Mays, which is a lot of fun. I've got a couple others. I've got a huge bass balalaika that I got in Palo Alto in 1967, I think, from a character named Dante Profumo. I'll never forget.
Great name.
Oh, just fantastic, and he was. in any case, it was 3-string, like all the balalaika. There's a contrabass and a bass. This is the bass. Next one's just the one that's slightly smaller. And by the way, while I was in D.C., I got to hear the Kirov Ballet. I love ballet and music made for ballet. And I got to hear the balalaika orchestras. You know, there's the cultural exchange program by Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. John Kennedy in the beginning of the 60s. Oh, you had these Russian players that were coming over for the first time, and we'd send our players over to Russia for the first time. So I got in on all of that. But hearing the balalaika orchestra, I was revisited by that in 1967 when I saw this big balalaika sitting there. And he collected all kinds of instruments. And I got this instrument and had Rick Turner convert it over and add the high G string, because he was EAD, and he did a lamination at the top and put in some real tuners because it was peg to peg. You gotta love that.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, and for those peg to peg, that means that there's no tuning gear in there, so it's very critical in getting your instrument in tune, and it really is the mark of the craftsman of that instrument, of how well that all works up there when you're going wood to wood with no gear ratio to step it down, you know. So in any case, we did that. He did that conversion, and I used it on a number of recordings. I did Third Week at the Chelsea with Jorma when we were with the Jefferson Airplane, and the engineers loved it. It recorded fantastically. But it is a big, huge triangle, and it is pretty unwieldy to play physically. But I will I'll take that instrument and play it, not to play necessarily everything I want to play on it, because it's not a fast instrument. It's made for slower progression of notes, but the neck's like a tree log on it, but the tone that comes out is just amazing. So this leads me full circle back here, and from the days of changing electronics and making instruments at Limbic No. 1 and whatnot, back here to 2013 with Tom and Bobby here talking about unfinished business. Unfinished business.
What a great way to put that, because it's a little bit like writing a song and never seeing it through to its final end. It's amazing.
I've learned a lot, because I used to, as a little biscuit, used to go down to Judah Street and see your basses being made, and I didn't even know of you or knew of you, this and that is all, and then got to see concerts and the inspiration between, like note chords. And back then I was going to the Carousel Ballroom, the Family Dog, Altamont Speedway was my first.
So was I.
Yeah, you see what I mean? And I was the little biscuit going, hey, check that out. But that was the first I heard. In other words, the difference was a tone, a sound where, like you said, I would hook you, and I was like, oh, wait a second, something else is going on here. So through all these years, I've learned so much and been inspired, and that's what has opened me up, is the different, your venture.
And,
I
have to remember back then, that wasn't, in 66 when they, 65 when the Jefferson Airplane was put together, we all just assembled. Half of them were folk musicians and blues, and they hadn't played electric guitar. I'd played electric bass in R&B bands, with full sax sections and Ray Charles covers and all this kind of stuff in the DC circuit and the bar scene. But out in that environment, I found myself encouraged to write my own bass for songs that hadn't been written. So we were putting all the music together, but one of the things that you forget back then is singers were still singing through Bogan sound systems.
Oh, that's right.
They're known as public address sound systems, where the voice all sounds like this coming out of a horn. So as people dropped out of various industries, in the aerospace industry and electronic industries, and as people filtered in and out of the draft and the war zone and whatnot, people came back with various skills. They came into an environment in the San Francisco scene back then that encouraged an individual approach, or if something was too unwieldy, to tear it down and build it back up again. So my primary concern in the beginning was to get more high fidelity, an old-fashioned word, into the bass guitar, because there wasn't the sound reinforcement that carried that low end. That's why we started stacking all these amplifiers up on stage, of course, which was even worse for the Bogan sound systems. And that's when, guys like Owsley Stanley, who worked on and gave me ideas for my first conversion of the Guild Starfire bass. We started talking about things like what Les Paul used to do is converted everything over to low impedance, which gave you a broader spectrum of sound. You heard more harmonics. It wasn't as loud as high impedance, which is kind of almost like squashing the sound like a compressor does and puts it out more in front of you. But that's what you have an amplifier for, So later on, high impedance was used a lot in basses in order to get them hotter, or in guitars to get them hotter, so you could distort and run and overdrive the preamps of your amplifiers. When they moved over, when they used high impedance in a bass, though, I believe a lot of times you lost some of the fidelity, some of the spectrum. So the way to make that up was flip it over to low impedance, but then we started putting in electronics in the instrument. Basically, what Ron Wickersham did with Owsley in the beginning was to match what we had in the studio, was basically put a strip in a more compact fashion to manipulate the tone. So it was all like a big lab. And basically, we were just sawing into the instruments. And the first one I had was nice, fancy. Owsley did a great carving, and it came in a module out. And we used a preamp with 9-volt battery. It was a very new thing. But then you could put bandpass filters in it, you could boost the lows, you could do these things and create a more control over the tone, a more fidelity of the tone. But you always had instruments that had their own unique sound. You had the Fender bass guitar, the Precision, and then the jazz bass, that were just fine not messing with them. Although I must admit, the jazz bass that I put together out here in California for Jefferson Airplane, I took the jazz bass and I put a P pickup butted it up right by the neck, and used concentric pots, and that was my idea. I did that to get more of the P pickup sound up here, but move it all the way up by the neck to get a rounder sound rather than that mid-rangey sound that came at you. Again, that drive to get back to a full, more open tone, but at the same time be able to use your finger dynamics to move back over the speaking length of the string if you want to get more mid-range or more articulation back by the bridge. But as the years went on and I saw that part of the industry develop into preamps, I realized two things happened. One, you got the sound of a miniature preamp in your bass instead of a nice tube warm preamp driving that. And I like to drive tube preamps. I'm a tube guy. So I like the power part to be tube, and I like the preamp to be tube. And there's hybrids and all that stuff developed later. But the other thing is that there was a peculiar sound and a rather static atmosphere to those preamps that go inside your instrument to what then was referred to as solid state. It didn't use a tube. And then I found out all of a sudden, no matter what I tried to do on the instrument, I got the same tone that came out. And then we're back to tone again, because I want to be able to control the tone with these things. So then after the 60s finished, we got in the 70s, we did the Olympic #1. One of the ideas that I was going over with Rick Turner as we were winding pickups and making different kinds of pickups is I said to him, we were building an instrument which was supposed to be just a hunk of wood and be done in 3 months. It took a year and a half. And this beautiful thing came out with purple heartwood and like all kinds of scrolling in the neck and everything. And a little stash box back here, I'll tell you about sometime. And hey, it was the 60s, what can I say?
Those were the days.
So he said, where do you want the pickups? And I said, I can't really decide. I said, I don't really want 3 pickups on the instrument. he said, well, why don't I put it on rails and slide it up and down? And it was all supposed to be about the experiment, the moving experiment. And Tom will explain to you in a few minutes how there's certain aspects of this that are going to be tuned and moved around, because this is the experiment here, and you should be able to not move so far forward to yourself that you're married to the first thing you put together. So he says, I'll put it on rails. So he put it on rails, and I remember messing around on stage, much to the annoyance of various other band members, and I'd move stuff around and listen to the difference, you know, and stage in the middle of songs and all that kind of stuff. And it was a great idea. It didn't ultimately work, that particular idea, because the pickup stopped coupling with the body, and I wanted to pick up the couple with the body a little more. Of course, there's different philosophies about that as well. But anyway, go ahead. That's my long story on that.
I'll head back homeward, way back across the hill. I'll head back homeward, way back across the hill. Baby don't love me no more, but I know the sister will.